It's a depressing prospect to defend somebody else's offensive beliefs, but protecting your own right to free speech and freedom of thought inevitably means having to protect everyone else's, regardless of how reprehensible those beliefs may be. Nicholas Brock, a 53-year-old man from Berkshire, has been sentenced to 5 years for having what the judge described as a toxic right wing ideology. This man had no links with any terror organisations. He had no plans to undertake any terrorist activity. What he had was 3 books in his possession, all of which can be purchased legally online. Those books were The Anarchist Cookbook, Knife Fighting Techniques from Folsom Prison, and Kill or Get Killed. None of these books are prohibited, and the mere owning of them is not an offence. That is, unless the police and the CPS decide otherwise. If you read any of the hysterical headlines dredged up by the media, then you'll be given the impression that Nicholas Brock is a Nazi terrorist ready to slaughter innocents in their bed. They laboured breathlessly to the point in describing the man who collected war memorabilia and hung them to his bedroom wall as a Nazi sympathiser whose stash of extremist material was likened to an undergraduate degree in the far right. He collected Nazi-era daggers, downloaded terrorism manuals, and even had a framed certificate of recognition from the Ku Klux Klan in his own name hanging on his wall. Police found a hoard of extremist literature, including a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf manifesto. Officers also found photographs of Brock wearing a Make America Great Again hat, posing in a balaclava while holding firearms, and with others making Nazi salutes. Headlines describing, in alarmist terms, designed to stoke up disgust. In most cases, I'm sure the headline itself is all the news that most people read. But no matter how many reports I read, most of which are just plagiarised from each other, I struggled to understand precisely what Nicholas Brock's crimes were, apart from having an unhealthy interest in an abhorrent ideology. None of the items Brock owned, listed in the news articles, were prohibited. Seemed to me that all Brock was guilty of was owning culturally offensive items, downloading tasteless videos, reading the wrong books, and looking at the wrong websites. All in the privacy of his own home where he lived with his mum. With not a hint of restraint, this is one of the pictures the Evening Standard published to demonstrate the sickening museum of Nazi worship. Because who else would own a giant donut-shaped pillow like that except Adolf Hitler himself? That's a lawful replica of a gun, by the way, and Brock was not accused nor prosecuted for any firearms offences, nor for the ownership of any prohibited articles. He was prosecuted solely under Section 58 of the Terrorism Act 2000, a statute so widely drawn you could drive a fleet of tanks through it. At trial, both the CPS and the judge admitted that Brock had no intention of utilising the information contained in the 3 books he was prosecuted for, but taken together with his toxic beliefs, that apparently was enough to warrant a 5-year sentence, imposed by a left-wing judge who adopts a very different standard to defendants upon genuine terrorist charges. When sentencing him, Judge Peter Lodder stated, "It is clear from the material found on your computer and your hard drive that you are a right-wing extremist. Your enthusiasm for this repulsive and toxic ideology is demonstrated by the graphic, racist, Islamophobic and white supremacist iconography which you have stored and appear to share with others of similar views. I do not sentence you for your political views, but the extremity of those views informs the assessment of dangerousness." Despite Lodder's buzzword-laden doublespeak, it was clear he was convicting Brock solely for his political views, imprisoning him not for something that he's done, but for something the state has deemed he might do in the future without a shred of evidence to prove it. If this isn't the very definition of a thought crime, then what is? It's just a shame that Judge Lodder doesn't hold consistent views toward other disciples of toxic ideology that appear before him. In 2019, he delayed sentencing a teenage supporter of Islamic terrorism who'd been planning random attacks on innocent members of the public with a hunting knife and had publicly announced his intention to stab people in the face and raise money to join ISIS. The judge wasn't happy with the first probation's report on the defendant, I assume because it was unfavourable to him, and he therefore granted a 6-week recess, insisting that a report be undertaken by someone who has experience in dealing with terror cases, aka someone who would be more favourable to the defendant's motives. When the teenager was finally sentenced, the judge chose to blame the game rather than the player, mitigating the man's murderous intent by saying, "I very much hope that you take advantage of the programs available to you in prison and realise radicalisation is not the way forward for you." He then handed him 3 years. Nicholas Brock was given 5 years and spared the apologetic send-off that's characteristic of Judge Peter Lodder. That's because Lodder, like most of the establishment, operate a two-tier criminal justice system, where religious terrorists are treated as victims of their own ideology, and those who hold extreme right-wing beliefs are treated as self-radicalising and denied all hope of mitigation. Just 6 months ago, the same Judge Lodder sentenced the ex-wife of hate preacher Abu Izzadeen for disseminating material and snuff videos inciting terrorist activity. She was only given 3 years and waved off with a Crimea River speech from Lodder where he all but apologised for her. It may well be that you were guided into the radical world by one or both of your second and third husbands, but it's clear that you quickly became an enthusiastic and committed ISIS supporter. I'm prepared to accept that you are now beginning to appreciate just how wrong it was to act as you did, and I hope you realise that you must have nothing to do with terrorism in the future. How out of touch with reality must you be to believe that a homicidal woman who chooses her men solely on their willingness to further terrorist acts will be brought to her senses by the patronising virtue signalling of a left-leaning judge? Nicholas Brock, on the other hand, is considered a lost cause with no hope of redemption because those that harbour extreme right-wing views are dismissed as the personification of evil with not the least chance of rehabilitation. Brock isn't the first person to be maliciously prosecuted under Section 58 for possessing a copy of the Anarchist Cookbook or similar unsavoury publications. The difference is, I don't know of any other cases where someone's been charged and convicted for owning articles under Section 58 without any additional charges, and for books that are entirely lawful to own. This is a worrying precedent that will inspire the police and the CPS to extend their persecution of anyone who harbours views that could be remotely equated to extremism. The investigation was spearheaded by Detective Chief Superintendent Kath Barnes, who is head of counter-terrorism police in South East, a common purpose acolyte who's been fast-tracked up the ranks to ensure that her neo-Marxist agenda can be enforced to its fullest. Kath Barnes wasn't promoted due to her abilities, because she has none. Her ability is to be a good government service droid and to ensure that the gods of political correctness are stocked up with human sacrifices. In this regard, Nicholas Brock is a political prisoner. He was prosecuted wrongly for his beliefs, but more importantly, to help the establishment even up the terrorist scorecard. The police, the CPS, and the state want you to believe that for every Islamic terrorist, there are an equal number of extreme right-wing terrorists. And where they come up empty-handed, they're willing to manufacture them, assisted by the press, seeking out anyone that has the remotest sympathy to extreme right-wing causes and dress them up in the clothing of Nazi terrorists. The mainstream media and social media serve as virtual pillories where the sedated public can engage in their 2 minutes of hate against their artificial enemies of the state and comfort themselves in the knowledge that terrorism can be attributed in equal measure to white Nazis as it can Islamic extremists. Due to our one-sided hate crime sentencing laws, Nicholas Brock will have to serve 2/3 of his 4-year term in jail with an additional year on licence. He might even be sent to Belmarsh, a Category A prison reserved for truly dangerous criminals, terrorists, and more recently, political enemies of the state. Compare and contrast this show trial to that of Anjem Choudhury, the hate preacher who openly supported and recruited for ISIS and remained untouched by our cowardly police for 2 decades. He eventually received a 5-year and 6-month sentence, and yet he served only 2 years of that sentence before being released. This means that Brock will serve more time behind bars for holding extreme views in his bedroom than a man who openly recruited and assisted murderers and terrorists for 20 years. I don't support Brock's views. I find his obsession with extreme right-wing ideology pathetic and repulsive, but I find the state's political targeting of him the most repulsive of all. This is book burning by backdoor political censorship, but rather than burn the book, they choose to burn the reader instead. The problem here is that Section 58 does not require reasonable suspicion that an article has a purpose connected to terrorist activity. The burden of proof also falls upon the defendant to show that they had a reasonable excuse for having the article in their possession. But Section 58 is so widely drawn, it enables the police to arrest anyone who purchases a particular book or downloads unsavoury content. They can then search that person's home, their devices and internet history, and use it as a means to find inference of bad intent and further a successful prosecution. This is what happens when the reasonable suspicion element is absent. It's used as leverage. Section 163 of the Road Traffic Act is a perfect example of this. The police require no reasonable suspicion or excuse to stop a vehicle, and they routinely abuse Section 163 as a means to stop drivers and find offences that they can prosecute for. Removing the reasonable suspicion element from an offence as serious as Section 58 of the Terrorism Act is a direct attack on free speech. Isn't it bad enough that we see the police readily throwing their weight around on the streets, abusing their powers and improvising the law as a means to enforce their petty grievances and insatiable egos, that they now have to take to the internet as well? But when the CPS and judges are pursuing cases to make terrorism appear to be multicultural, then you're no longer being prosecuted in a fair and just society. You're up against a dictatorship. Trying to enforce your right to free speech and freedom of thought against the criminal justice cartel we currently have operating in this country is like bringing a plastic spoon to a gunfight.